So I'm David Ng. I'm going to have Zad give the presentation. I'll take all the hard questions later. Thanks.
Thank you. So nice to be here. I'm just going to tilt the mics a little bit more. So pacing changes with living system, rhythmic threads and textures. What in the world does that even mean? And that's the point of me being here. So that's the challenge at hand, is to explain that. So picture's a little dark, but we're actually a part of a group in Toronto working on systems changes learning. We started around 2019. David said, can you meet every 3 weeks? I was like, yeah, sure. He's like, can you do that for 10 years? I was like, oh, sure. So we're in year 7 of 10 of this idea of rethinking systems thinking. And these are some of our friends here, Dan and Kelly as well. This is a shot from a few years back. So we've been meeting every week and trying to understand or rethink through systems thinking, and I'll explain what that might entail. I often like to start presentations with getting right to the single-minded takeaway. So if there's nothing else you understand, then the main thing to understand is this idea of thinking about, are we adjusting our pace? Yeah. Adjusting your pace to match the world, or adjusting the lights to match your presentation. That's basically the key takeaway. Yeah, that's on me actually. My slides are a little dark, so I appreciate that, Ray. Thank you. So that's the single-minded takeaway if you don't take anything else from this. There's kind of 4 chapters to this. I won't go in elaborate detail through all of them. The main thing will be landing this idea, but I'll quickly just touch on the background context of where we're coming from, our own language of how we're reconceptualizing systems as living systems, and a conceptual model, and finally this idea of the pacing changes. So just a little bit of background. Since about the last 7 years and more, there's been a rising interest in systems change that we've seen. So everyone from the OECD to McConnell Foundation in Canada, but I forgot to mention we're from Toronto, Canada, in case you can't tell by the accent. Stanford Social Innovation Review, UN, everyone's talking about systems change, and this has been increasingly in the vocabulary. And along with that, you get an increasing or overwhelming increase in the models and toolkits that are all out there. So if you just do a Google search on systems change, you'll just get all these visualizations and things like that. And what our contention or what argument we put forward is that there's a tendency to see systems change that is born from the idea of freeze, change, unfreeze. And we do not equate that with living systems. So this whole idea that there's a system that's moving, it's living, it's going about it, but in order to exert some change in the world, we're going to freeze it, modify it, and then do something, and that's not exactly where we're coming from. So that kind of leads us to this question about what do you do? How do you approach systems change when there's really no pause button? There is no getting off the track. The living system is unfolding in real time. You can't stop it. So how do you go about affecting it? And so that leads us to starting from a completely different premise than many others. And this is that we see living systems as threads. Whoa. The HDMI gets loose. And it comes back. We see living systems as threads rhythmically weaving through time. So this is a fundamental reconception of systems. We don't think about it in a spatial way. We think about it as literally, think about it as a line, and it's creating, what I'll go on to explain as a texture, and it's through time. So heavy emphasis placed on the time orientation. Okay, so let me just unpack that briefly. And so that starts with the processual ontology. We go all the way back to just Heraclitus and not Sun Tzu, Lao Tzu, about seeing the world as a constant state of change. And so, whether it's no man steps in the same river twice or any other idea, the entire world is moving and unfolding. So that's a big part of it. So the processual view is that we see reality as dynamic versus static, which emphasizes time for us over space. The idea is to see the world as made up of processes moving through time. So we emphasize that most fixed structures, even something as foundational as, say, a mountain in the landscape, you might think of that as a structure, but really it's a slow moving process. So we downplay the perception of reality as snapshots in time, hence why we don't see it as freeze, change, unfreeze. And this is drawn off of Heraclitus and Lao Tzu and J.J. Gibson. There's many others, but I'm just dropping a couple of loose references. So that's one element of our premise on us having a processual view. And again, I'm just building up the vocabulary to our way of conceptualizing systems. We also draw off of one of your fellow Brits, Tim Ingold, and the idea of lines, threads, weaves, and rhythms. And I just love how even in his lectures, he goes old school with the projector and he starts drawing out his lessons. So it's just wonderful because he fully is immersed and believes in that. So we draw a lot off of Tim Ingold in conceptualizing threads. So threads and rhythms are about understanding the natural unfolding of a living system. And so here the idea is that all living systems have this natural inherent rhythm that's coming out. And we emphasize our system of interest as a thread moving through time. And so this is where we think of systems as these sine waves that are weaving through. So it's not a fixed structure in a space, and it's going through it. It has its own pace and it's going through its own phases. So we downplay the understanding of systems as a set of parts in a spatial configuration. And this is drawn off of Tim Ingold, Life of Lines, in addition to his other bodies of work, as well as any classical Chinese medicine or any philosophy of body kind of sees this idea of living systems moving through time. So then that leads us to living systems as threads. These rhythmic lines weave together in what is a texture. So when these systems interact, we're not describing it as the government system, it's just a big texture of it all together. So the texture is what your system of interest is weaved into when multiple systems intersect at a point in time. We emphasize the larger fabric that your thread is entangled with. So this visual on the left here, this is from a clip about a Vietnamese fish market. And so you might ask yourself, if you're there, where's the market? Where can I go to the fish market? And they might look at you funny. They might, because it's more about what we emphasize is when is the fish market. And so literally the different boats that carry different produce or different product will meet on the riverbanks, and you kind of just hop around, or you're in a boat and you go and they buy and sell and exchange. I think this is the B2B side, by the way. They're probably getting their inventory in stock, but as you can see here, people are purchasing and it's all coming together. So this would be a system that is occurring in time through this process of literally moving through. And so it's not so much to say as there's a fixed place as much as there is a point in time when this market comes together. And so that's why we downplay the neat system boundaries that delineate inside versus outside between a system. This is drawn off of another person, Keecock Lee in Manchester, on the concept of contextual dyadic thinking, which is drawn off of some also classical Chinese philosophy, and as well as socio-ecological systems, which I know this group is familiar with, tracing back to Emery and Trist. And one last concept just to touch on is the dynamic, ever-shifting propensity in the texture. So all of these have a propensity for a potential that can be kind of leveraged or extracted from. So propensity is the inherent potential for change in a particular situation. So the idea is that there's a unique situation in a texture that has a tendency towards change. So we emphasize exploiting the tendency towards a desired change with the living system when the living system's natural behaviors interact. So this visual here is someone's fishing, and you can put some bait in the water, and so a couple of fishes try to nibble on it, one gets another one, and then eventually that one bites and it goes up. And I think the idea of what we're saying here, there's a natural tendency for these fish to look at a curious piece of food, and they're going to naturally nibble on it. And so the concept is of extracting or leveraging the propensity here is about when and where are you going to fish? HDMI break. And so, someone, you can go ice fishing, you can go other fishing, but trying to go in a time and place where it's where there's a lot of fish, you're probably going to have a better chance. And so we downplay determining a desired change and pushing systems towards it, regardless of time. So there's this kind of absolutist idea of just pushing for change regardless of whether or not the window is the right moment or not. And that's drawn from Sun Tzu, and a lot of this is from Francois Julien's propensity of things. Okay, so that's kind of a brief, really quick intro about some of our own vocabulary and concepts that link together about having a processual view of systems, looking at rhythms and threads, and the texture and the propensity that comes along with it. And so there's a conceptual model and method that we also use. I won't go too long into this. So it's drawn off of some, and again, this is why David Hing is here to explain or take some of the hard questions, but this is drawn off of classical Chinese medicine, where you have like different seasons of change. And I'll briefly go through it. I won't go through it too much in depth, but our approach essentially focuses on asking better questions about the nature of change that's unfolding. So if we're working with a client or someone who wants to work on systems, we might not start from that traditional standpoint about mapping it. Rather, it's about what are the type of questions that we can start from in understanding that. So in the center is understanding or knowing from within. So what's the system of interest that you can reasonably influence? We don't necessarily subscribe to exerting a force on systems that you're not directly a part of or that you can't know. So knowing from the inside is highly critical. What filling or emptying processes are affecting your rhythm are some of the questions. Then we move up to recognizing the textural influences. So are there external changes disrupting your system? What shifts are loosely or tightly coupled to your system? What trends do you expect to continue otherwise? So it's like what's happening in your texture. Then we move to diagnosing rhythmic disorders. This is just this idea of how are you feeling? Like, are you feeling is your rhythm a little off, or is it a little bit off, or is it quite a bit off? Can you explain why it's off? Do you expect it off just to last a long time or a little bit of time? Again, this is this idea that you kind of just know that something's not feeling right today. A crude example, or knowing from within, but actually I'll come back to that one. Then we go to the bottom. It's like, when is it a good or bad time to make the change? Where in the landscape does this change work best, and who likes this change and who doesn't like it? So you're prognosing what are the likelihoods of this potential change if your rhythm is off, how that is going to stick, how well, what could happen. And finally, we get to reordering pacing. So these are about what are the commitments for doing more and faster. Again, the language here is it's time-oriented. So it's about the speed and it's about the pace. And what are the commitments for doing less or slower? And this really draws off of, I don't have the reference in here, but like Stuart Brand and pace layering, where you want to look at all the different paces that are unfolding, and different elements of a system have their own natural timeline and tendency. So what can you commit to moving faster or slower? You have to kind of think through that full stack. Okay, so I know I went through that quickly, but with all that said, I kind of want to explain this idea of pacing changes, and that's kind of the goal here. As you recall, the single-minded takeaway was, are we adjusting your pace to match the world, or are we adjusting the world to match your pace? And we have to kind of think about these two at the same time. So using this hub and four spokes idea, when we look at it from either moving 12 o'clock at the top to 3 o'clock on the right, or 12 o'clock at the top to 9 o'clock, you can kind of think of it as this one is the idea of repacing a single rhythmic thread inside a texture. So adjusting your pace to fit others, or the context, is kind of another way of putting it. Maybe you experienced a leg injury or something like that, so you might be walking slower or whatever. You might not get your entire family to slow down with you. You might say, you know what, I'll catch up with you later. I'll meet you at the rendezvous point or something like that. So you're going to adjust your pace to the rest of the context. Going the other direction, because although we went around clockwise, you don't necessarily have to in this model. This way is about repacing a rhythmic texture around a thread. So this is getting others to adjust their pace to fit you. So again, in that same example, we want to think about when we're working on systems change, how much are we trying to tell the world to change? And how much force are we exerting on that to have them fit according to where you're coming from or what that work is? And this is a fundamental, it's not wrong, it's not right, there's no way to frame it that way, but I think it's a nuance in understanding the different paces that we're working with. And so understanding those paces becomes really critical, and that's kind of the main concept here around what we're working on. So that leads to a really big emphasis on this concept of pacing changes focusing on kairos over chronos. And I think kairos is this idea of felt time, right? So, yeah. So, there are moments and times in our life or sensations where it just feels like time slowed down. Like you hear people say that as a saying, oh, I just felt like time slowed down. Or you lose yourself in time because you're working on something so deeply and you can't believe the hours have blown by. Or in some Eastern architecture where rather than taking the shortest path over the water, they have you go a winding route because they want you to slow down, immerse yourself in appreciating the design of the museum or the thing. So there's an element of how kairos kind of just comes up. And so much of our world today, especially in the post-industrialized era, and everything is working on chronos, right? So literally, what time are we meeting up and what is the universal time that we're all working towards? And I think this idea of recasting systems as living systems gets us asking the question, can we reappreciate the kairos, the felt time that others have throughout on all the systems that we're interacting with? Whether it's, and many folks here work with the government system, so you might have different seasonalities when they're looking for, they want to spend their budget at a certain time of year. Or perhaps, a certain change in policy is occurring and you know that the government has shifted and they're not going to make any long-term commitments or something like that. So the sense of timing is the argument that we're making is becoming critical. And we're promoting an idea of systems, living systems with this focus on kairos and felt time. And so that kind of brings this, this visualization. I won't say where I've lifted these from, but there's this idea of like, there's this whole knot and a whole web of a system that's there. Are you going to find your way of how to work with that system as you're going about the change and tie yourself within? Or are you going to go off on a different rhythm and try to pull others along with you and see if they can match you as well? Not provoking any right or wrong direction, but these are the ideas of what we think about when we talk about pacing changes, and that's some of the work that we're doing based out of Toronto in Canada. So that's going back to just the final single-minded takeaway is like thinking about adjusting your pace to match the world in parallel and or adjusting the world to match your pace. So what is our approach? What are you working on? And where is the emphasis placed? I think I'm actually ahead of time, so that's all right. But that is my explanation, at least, to pacing changes with living systems, rhythmic threads and textures, rhythmic textures of threads. Hopefully you can understand that title a little bit better, and maybe I did my job, but you can let us know afterwards. Yeah, thank you very much. Looking forward to having conversations at your pace, at your leisure. Myself and David are around.